This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Gertrude. Like the rest of us, she was getting on a bit. Still spry, but with hubby gone and the kids with kids of their own. Let's just say Gertrude had seen better years. But the best was yet to come. One day Gertrude had just hopped off the crosstown bus and was waiting for another one to take her home when nature called. If you know what I mean. She'd been at a tea social most of the afternoon. She was not in the more fashionable part of town and there wasn't a gas station in sight. Gertrude slipped into one of those snooty little dress shops to see if she could find an understanding sales clerk. The place was filled with the upper crust, the kind of place where if you have to ask how much, you can't afford it. Gertrude discreetly whispered to the wealthiest-looking sales girl she'd ever seen, asking if she might use the facilities. The woman noticed Gertrude's discount shoes and announced the washrooms were reserved for customers only. All the rich ladies stared at her and Gertrude hightailed it out of there. She felt like the biggest loser in the world and would have liked to have crawled on home. But when you have to go, so she kept on looking. She tried the big video store across the street and things looked good at first. But when Gertrude mentioned her problem, the teenage clerks just spouted a long list of rules and regulations. And she had no more luck at the cafe next door, or the variety store on the corner or the laundromat. By this time, things were getting pretty desperate. A terrible accident was a distinct possibility. But suddenly across the street, Gertrude spotted a funeral parlor. She knew it was terrible, but she was forced to buzz his friend or family and get to the ladies' room before it was too late. Instead of robotic teenagers, there was a pair of creepy funeral directors waiting right inside the front door. They smiled solemn and so sad for you smiles, and Gertrude nodded her thanks for their sympathy. And just when she thought the worst was over, the creepier of the two pulled out a guest book and insisted that she sign. So Gertrude signed. She felt awful about it, but she put her whole name down even though she never heard of the dearly departed. And finally, after all her troubles and all her humiliation, the lady was free to go. She slipped down the corridor to the powder room and the problem was solved. But on her way out of the little girl's room, she saw the undertaker spying on her and thought she'd better pay her last respects before making her getaway. So she went into the parlor. There was no one there besides the poor dead soul himself. There were all these empty chairs and the biggest, most expensive casket you ever saw, but not one mourner. So Gertrude made her way up to the coffin and peered in. The man inside was old, really old, and he looked as stern as could be. But Gertrude could see a mischievous crinkle around his eyes, and she felt sorry for him all alone there with no one to say goodbye. So she just whispered, "Thanks a lot. You really saved my life." And she caught the next bus home. A week or so later, Gertrude was just dusting round her tiny apartment when the mail came and there was a letter from some lawyer she had never heard of. Seeing the old man at the funeral home had been stinking rich but had fought with every single member of his family. So he made up this will leaving all his money to anybody who bothered to show up at his funeral. They checked the guest book and Gertrude's was the only name there. This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. And the first thing Gertrude did with all that loot was but that fancy boutique and boot the snooty sales lady right out the door.